We are starting a new class. We're back in Dave's books. We're in his last book now. We're on the last books of the New Testament. And I was hoping some of our new members would have been here, but there's no one here.
They're coming here. They're just climbing the stairs.
Oh, are they? Well, then they'll miss the quick review, but it'll bring us back up to speed. But anyway, everyone, members, our library of Bible books that Dave always starts with. And as you see now, we're in the bottom rack of the letters. We're in 2 Thessalonians now. And when we ended our overview last time in 1 Thessalonians, some time ago, we'd left the Apostle Paul, if you remember, we left him in Corinth while he was on his second missionary or preaching journey, whichever you like. And slide 3 helps remind us that if you recall up here where the number 1 is, Silas and Timothy are with Paul, and they've traveled now through the regions of Galatia and Phrygia, and it was in this area where they are now that God prohibited them from preaching in Asia and Bithynia. You see Asia and Bithynia is up the top near the Black Sea there. And so upon reaching Troas, if Paul had been wondering now where God wanted them to go, that worry was erased in a vision that Paul had, where a man from Macedonia was calling out for spiritual help. And Paul concluded then that vision, through that vision, that God wanted him to take the gospel to Europe. And so him and his companions sailed out, and they boarded a ship, and they left for Macedonia. And then if you remember reaching his destination, Paul then visited Philippi first, then Thessalonica, then Berea, and then Athens. And in Athens, he converted Dionysius and Damaris and others that were with those pair. And then he was off to Corinth. And it was while he was in Corinth for a year and a half that he wrote both 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. And you recall, this picture we have here, this was taken in 1890. Okay, it gives you before Thessalonica expanded onto the hillside surrounding the town. And then this slide, you remember, this is modern Thessalonica now. And as you can see, it's a port city on the Aegean Sea. And it was also located, if you remember, at 2 major Roman roads. And you see here that yellow line, you remember the Egnatia Way? And the Egnatian Way from west from Thessalonica went on to Rome, and east went all the way back into Turkey. And the population in Paul's day is kind of estimated at around 200,000. It's about half of what it is today. But it was a strategic trade center. Okay, and it had connections by land through that Egnatian Way, and that you see there, it's on a bay in the Aegean Sea. And so it was a busy port city also. And it was in Paul's time, this was a prosperous city, Thessalonica. And slide 7 here shows the road. This would have served, actually, if you recall, as a Roman military passage for the Roman army to go right across the nation. And caravans from the east and west crowded this road also. I thought of it as the 401 of the first century. It was a busy place. And slide 8, you've seen these pictures. This was part of the old city, and they've kind of newly constructed the amphitheater or as it was called then, the Odeon. And I use these slides just to point out, you'll see in a little bit why I kind of remind us of all this. Spectators would sit here and view and listen to whatever was going on in the forum from here. This was the downtown meeting place, and buying and selling of goods went on here. Social debates would have been carried out. As I said, Thessalonica was a thriving metropolis in Paul's day. And the other view of here is where the forum is. The forum was always out before the Odeon, where people sat. And as we said last time we ended this series, most of modern day Thessalonica is built over top of the old city. So there isn't a lot of excavations going on. The ruins here, if you remember, were buried under the bus terminal. They moved the bus terminal in 1962, and the forum and a bathhouse was underneath it. And pottery was found here that they think dated to like 60 BC. And I'd not be surprised as I looked at these if this was another spot that Paul would have gathered and taught. This was a public forum. And who knows, maybe Paul was there. But this little trip in secular history gives us a better understanding of 1 Thessalonians 1 and verse 8. That reads, "For the word of the Lord has sounded forth from you, not only in Macedonia and Achaia, but also in every place your faith towards God has gone forth, so that we have no need to say anything." This is a testimony of the Thessalonians' remarkable faith. It was known abroad that we're told. And that meant to me that these brethren were meeting travelers in their marketplaces. They were meeting people on the docks. They would have been down there. The merchants would have been buying and selling goods off the ships. And they were spreading the gospel. And why I say that is because, which in turn, as this verse says, would be carried by those travelers, those people that they were meeting. And it would go back to their hometowns. And I found that interesting. It reminded me of Daniel 11 and verse 32, where we read, "But the people who know their God will display strength and take action." A little out of context, but it fits with the Thessalonians. They had the strength and the will to teach others, proclaim to others, and they took action and spread that. And then we move on now to our origin, and we come to our title section. And Dave has asked us, to whom is the book of 2 Thessalonians addressed, and why would Silvanus, Silas is the Greek rendering of that name, and Timothy be included in the opening greeting of the letter? I put some of the verses up to kind of help us move along. We'll start with you, Naomi, at the back. You could read that, please. Okay. So the first part of our question was, to whom was this book addressed? Who's it addressed to?
Church of Thessalonica.
Right. The church or the brethren at Thessalonica. Okay? Always remember that from 1 Thessalonians. But with Paul's name at the beginning of this salutation, we know then that it's an inspired letter, right? The Apostle Paul. But the second part of our question, why are Silvanus or Silas, and Timothy mentioned? Why would they be mentioned here? Were they inspired apostles? Roger?
No, but from Acts, they were left in, I don't know whether, Silas, I think was too. They were left in Thessalonica when Paul went to Athens. Well, when they were left in Berea and Thessalonica, the area, when Paul had to flee to Athens. And this book, I'm sure you're going to get to, was written sometime a little after that, and so they were well known to these brothers. And so, like, as far as Silas and Timothy probably have reached Paul by then, and would have, like, as far as it would have been a greeting to them, these are people they know.
Right, exactly. That's a good point. Another point I thought of in Romans 16 and verse 22, I have some passages here I just want us to read. I can read them. 16 and 22. This gives us another idea of why Paul mentioned other Christians, other men that helped him in his efforts of preaching. But in 16 and 22, we read there, I, Tertius, who wrote this epistle, greet you in the Lord. Paul was the author of Romans, but he dictated this letter, the Roman letter, to a secretary or a scribe named Tertius, who copied those words, who wrote Paul's words. And all the other ones that are mentioned in verse 21 or 23, 21 to 23, Gatius, Erastus, Quartus, those are other members. They were fellow workers with Paul. And that should tell us, it would tell us, that they would all be in agreement with what Paul was writing. They agreed with his teaching and his letters. And Paul always signed his own name and added a salutation in his own handwriting. Colossians, because I was reading where some say that these letters really aren't Paul's. Well, if you're dictating your letter, if Jeremy's dictating a sermon to me and I'm writing it down for him because he's broke his hand or something, those are Jeremy's words. I'm just being the scribe, being the writer. But if you look at Colossians 4 and verse 18 is an example. This salutation by my own hand. Paul is saying now that this salutation is by my own hand. And remember my chains. And he does that again in 1 Corinthians 16 and 21. And in 2 Thessalonians, we'll just look at that one quickly. We'll talk about it a little later on. But 2 Thessalonians 3 and verse 17, the salutation of Paul with my own hand, which is a sign in every epistle, so I write. Proof here was necessary here because Paul, we'll see later in this letter, Paul suspected that the brethren in Thessalonica had received a letter falsely claiming he wrote it. Paul didn't write it, but it was attributed to him. So Paul, this is another proof that Paul would have used to have those members know that, no, this is my word. And also, Silas, as Jeremy had mentioned, he participated in the founding of the church at Thessalonica in the beginning. And that was in Acts 17. And Timothy also, if you recall, remember when Paul was in Corinth, Timothy brought him a report from the Thessalonican church. So that really had been the reason for Paul back in 1 Thessalonians 3. I'm just jumping around here a bit so it brings back to our mind. But now that Timothy has come to us and brought us good news of your faith and love, and that you always have good remembrance of us, greatly desiring to see us, as we also to see you. Therefore, brethren, in all our affliction and distress, we were comforted concerning you by your faith. For now we live, if you stand fast in the Lord. So the whole thought of Paul mentioning those men, they weren't inspired apostles. Some would write Paul's letters, and then another reason he would mention them, the same as we would in this day. If Jeremy went somewhere for a gospel meeting and took Jeff, he might well mention that in his report. So it simply shows that all these men that were with Paul agreed with him, and that Paul's words were inspired. So we move on from there to our section on the author. I always think of Gord when we hit these sections on how he answers some of these questions. But how do the following passages, we're always asked, provide confirmation in support of Paul as the author of 2 Thessalonians? And our first verse is 2 Thessalonians 1:1. And Gord, I'll get you to read that.
Paul, Silvanus, and Timothy to the church of Thessalonians in God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ.
Okay, what would be in this verse that would make us think of Paul as the author?
He is one of the three mentioned. It could have been Silvanus and Timothy, but he's mentioned first.
Right.
And we're gonna get to the others, I know, but he's mentioned first. Usually the writer of the letter is mentioned first.
Right, exactly. That's usually what Gord says. And Paula, do you feel like reading?
Do you not remember that while I was still with you, I was telling you these things?
Okay. So why would we think that Paul is speaking here?
I told you these things and now I'm writing these things to you. I told you these things and I'm writing it to you.
Right.
It's the same thing. I'm the one.
Right, Phoebe, right. And if you read the first few verses in chapter 2, Paul is speaking. And then he reminds them. And we'll look at this, why he's reminding them here. We'll look at that a little bit later in another question. And 2 Thessalonians 2 and verse 15. Sandra, do you want to read that?
So then, brethren, stand firm and hold to the traditions which you were taught, whether by word of mouth or by letter from us.
Okay, and why would we think Paul was the author through this verse?
Us includes Paul and someone else.
Right. If you remember the beginning of the letter, it mentions himself first, as Jeremy said. It mentions Silas, and it mentions Timothy. They were the us, okay, who had corrected the Thessalonians. And then the last verse, Jeff, please.
For even when we were with you, we used to give you this order: if anyone is not willing to work, then he is not to eat either.
Okay. What do we see there that would, again, give us a thought?
They would remember what Paul had taught them about that.
Right.
They know that he's just repeating something that he has already instructed.
Right, Jeff. And the we again, to Silas and Timothy, all the way through that 2 Thessalonians. Luke always speaks of the we's, of the they, and Paul does the same thing. So we can be assured that Paul was the author, and as we said a few minutes ago, there was times when Paul would have someone else write for him. That did not discredit the inspiration of those words. Oh, Jared?
Did he not use 2 Thessalonians chapter 3:17?
Maybe, yes.
Okay. You're going
Okay.
to that?
No, you go ahead.
As the salutation of Paul with my own hand, which is a sign of every epistle I write. Like as far as that's in 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 17.
Right.
That's the most, like as far as, I think you could argue from all the 4 verses that, well, it could be Paul, Silas, or Timothy, or all 3 of them combined, whereas Paul, as you said earlier, sometimes had a scribe, but this one, at least the salutation part, is written by his own hand.
Right.
And he says that's a sign of every epistle I write, that I sign it.
Right. That's right. Yeah, I had that verse earlier. That was proof to the Thessalonians that he wrote to them. And as I said earlier, well, we'll look at that a little bit later because I'm not sure the verse that I want, but it'll come up. But it'll tell us the reason why he said that, what you just said there. So then we'll move along now to our date section. And most of us have seen our timeline now since we began David Dann's series in Genesis, with the most important date for mankind, and that is 30 AD. Christ now has revealed his Father to man. He's finished his purpose for coming by dying upon the cross as the sacrifice for our sins. And at this point now, 30 AD, he's become the author and finisher of our faith. And this is the beginning now of the Christian dispensation. And God has last spoken now to Malachi, if you recall, in 400 BC. And this was has made his last appeal for his people now to turn from their disobedience to him and serve him acceptably. And they turned a deaf ear to him. And God did not speak again now until, remember, the angel Gabriel spoke to Mary and made the announcement that she had found favor in God's eyes and that she would conceive in her womb the baby Jesus through the power of the Holy Spirit. And then with his death in 30 AD, as is shown, the old covenant now was nailed to the cross. And then our next benchmark that Dave always has is 70 AD. And here we have the destruction of Jerusalem. And then we back up to Paul's first Roman imprisonment. This was in Rome now, not Caesarea. This was his first imprisonment in the vicinity of 59 and 62 AD. And in this period, Paul wrote Philemon, Colossians, Ephesians, and Philippians. And then now we move back in time to Paul's second preaching journey. And this one was between 49 and 52 AD. And his visit now and work in Thessalonica took place in the early part of this journey. And then in the latter part of this journey, if you recall, Paul remained in Corinth for 18 months. And there is where he wrote 1 Thessalonians. And then a little later on, while he was still in Corinth, he wrote 2 Thessalonians. And so that date for those writings is usually around 51 to 52 AD. Sure.
You have to think, if you read the book of Acts, especially when these two books were written, if it was written in Corinth, that's most likely. Paul, if you read it there, it's likely in Thessalonica for less than a month.
Right.
He was quickly driven out by the angry Jews in Jerusalem, yet he still wrote to this church, and it probably is the reason why he wrote to this church. Silas and Timothy, yes, and Luke. Luke stayed behind in Thessalonica, according to, if we follow the book of Acts. And so he's concerned about this church because he didn't have a long time to really teach them. Others did, but he didn't.
Right.
And so he took a special concern for them, even though he had not been there a long time.
Right. We'll look at that thought. Remember that, as that comes up again. But as I was looking at these dates, and we know we're never dogmatic with our dates, roughly. We use these dates. But this gives us an idea of Paul's zeal for the Lord. Because we're reminded that Paul wrote 14 epistles, 14 letters within this time frame from roughly 50 AD to 67 AD. It's not a long time. And Paul wrote 14 epistles within that time. Jeremy kind of goes with his thought. It points out Paul's concern for the brethren that he had met, that he had taught, and shows his worry for them after he is gone. So now we move into our section then entitled Our Purpose for 2 Thessalonians, and we look at the historical sections first. Paul's letter to the Thessalonians provided them with encouragement to remain faithful, no matter what the circumstance was. And it also provided them with answers to the question of the second coming of Christ, which we'll look at in a bit. But it was being distorted by false teachers. And also in his letter, he taught the members how to deal with those that were living in disobedience to God. And he also solicited their prayers on behalf of himself and his fellow workers. So that was just kind of an intro. But Dave's asked us, why was Paul thankful for the Thessalonians? And why was the faithfulness of this church especially impressive? And our passage is 2 Thessalonians 1, 3-5. And I have 3 and 4 up. Tammy?
You're bound to thank God always for you, brethren, as in his goodness, because your faith grows exceedingly, and the love of everyone of you all abounds toward each other, so that we ourselves boast of you among the churches of God, in your patience and faith, and all your persecutions and tribulations that you endure.
And verse 5. Lisa, can you see that? Verse 5? Okay, thank you. I caught you off guard there. I saw your head down your purse. Didn't realize. The verse before this says something interesting. It says, we are bound to thank God, Paul says. Bound, or another word here from the Greek, is urged on. Okay, Paul was urged on in his attitude to give thanks to God. And why was he urged on? Why was he bound? What does this verse tell us? What was he? Was he hearing false things of this church? Or was he hearing great truths, would you say, of this church? That's what he was hearing of, wasn't it? Their works, as Jeremy said, Paul had maybe only been there a month, and then Timothy came and gave Paul a report. And their works had increased considerably from that time, because their works had increased, because their faith had increased, and their love for one another also was part of that growth also. And there was so much joy in the hearts of Paul and Silas and Timothy that Paul says here, depending what version you have, the New King James says boasted. Paul boasted of them. The New American Standard says he spoke proudly of them. And the American Standard Version says he gloried in them. And he done this to other congregations. And he done this because of their patience and the faith that they displayed. And as I thought about this and looked into it a little deeper, Paul was not above praising one church to other churches. He did that to provoke the church that he was speaking to good works. 7 times, I looked into the words of the Greek, 7 times in the New Testament, Paul uses the Greek word for this thought. And it's not used in a sense of vanity or being puffed up. Instead, it means he spoke very commendably of them. And he also used those words, boasted, spoke proudly, and glory. He also spoke of that, of the gospel, of what God had done through his gospel with man. And I wrote down some verses, 2 Corinthians 1 and 14. He uses, depending on what version you have, this thought of boasting. Corinthians 7, 4 and 14, he uses the same. And the Greek word, which I am not about to try and pronounce, but I spell it out if you'd like it. But he used this idea of boasting, as we said. It wasn't to raise a sense of vanity or being vain. Paul used every effort that he could to encourage others. And he used Thessalonica as an example because their faith had blown Paul away, in my words. And as I thought about that, I thought, where we read, just as a side point, churches of God and churches of Christ, remember in Romans 16 and 16, they're the same thing. And they're the same because God and Christ are one in spirit and one in purpose. But the thought of patience and faith here jumped out at me. They're coupled together here. Patience and faith in all your persecutions and tribulations. To me, they're coupled together because our patience will be no greater than our faith, the way I see it. What made this church so impressive to Paul was the persecutions and tribulations that they had endured. And the first would be physical mistreatment, and the second would be the effect that those persecutions have on their minds. In other words, the worrisome concern that would be put upon those people. And Paul understood very well persecutions, and so did the Thessalonians. As Jeremy said earlier, Acts 17, if you recall, that records, remember, I'll just get it here and we'll pop up a couple verses. Acts 17, 1-9. Remember, this is when Paul and Timothy and Silas, now they passed through Philippi and Philippus and Apollonia. Now they're in Thessalonica. And we're told in verse 2, Paul, as his custom was, now he's meeting in the synagogues again, teaching. And we see in verse 4, some are persuaded. And then in verse 5, the Jews, they're not persuaded. And there was a great multitude of that. And that's where the big conference come. These Jews drag out Jason, a man that was with Paul. They drag them out. They bring them before the magistrates. This is the Jews that are doing this. So we're just reminded that right from the beginning, the very birth of that church, they're being persecuted physically. And that has a mental effect on people. No matter how strong we are as Christians, when we're physically abused for our belief, that's going to shake us. And it will cause concern. And it won't make our faith any less. But immediately we try and think of ways, how are we going to handle this? And so, because we've never been through physical in this country, it makes us appreciate the courage of the Thessalonians. And they proved their faith, by enduring persecutions. And that shows God that they and we also, when that happens, that we're true disciples. And He will not allow temptations beyond what we can endure. But as always, as Corinthians tells us, we'll be shown a way of escape.
I'm not ashamed to own my Lord.